want to take a moment to note the appointment of Tiff Macklem as the next Governor of the Bank of Canada. Mr. Macklem, who is currently the Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, has extensive experience in the global financial system and risk management. With his appointment, the Bank of Canada will be well positioned to help with the economic response and eventual recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Of course, we now know who the new governor is, the new head of the Bank of Canada. What do we know about him, David?
Right, so Tiff Macklem, as you mentioned, he worked at the Bank of Canada for a long time, and then he left the bank after Governor Poloz was appointed 7 years ago. He had been the senior deputy governor to former bank governor Mark Carney, and as I say, then Poloz got appointed, and everybody said, well, Tiff Macklem got passed over. So Macklem left the bank, and he, as you mentioned, he's been down at the University of Toronto at the Rotman School of Management, but now he comes back as the governor. He was born in 1961, married from Montreal, completely bilingual, and he was again, the senior deputy governor, so the right-hand man to Mark Carney during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. Now, that crisis was very different than the current crisis we're in. Back then, we had literally the financial systems of the world falling apart, and extraordinary action had to be taken there. In everywhere but Canada, it involved central banks or governments owning banks. That's not the case this time, as Governor Macklem said, or Governor Designate Macklem said today. This is a very different one, and the key goal for the bank, there won't be any change from what Governor Poloz is doing, is making sure there's enough liquidity in the system, and liquidity is bank talk for borrowing, making sure that businesses can borrow capital that they need, making sure that individual Canadians can borrow the money they need to get through what everybody expects will be a relatively short-term crisis, but the fall-on effects will be relatively long-term. So I would say, looking at Macklem's appointment, very much a continuation of the same strategies as before. One other tiny little note, the current senior deputy governor of the bank is a woman named Carolyn Wilkins, and I say woman. Canada has never had a female Bank of Canada governor. All the G20 central bank governors but one are men. Might have been a good opportunity, despite Tiff Macklem being eminently qualified, might have been a good opportunity for a feminist government, a feminist prime minister, to advance gender equality one more time by appointing Carolyn Wilkins. But here's one other thing. The last three Bank of Canada governors worked for the bank, left for the bank, came back as governor. So maybe Wilkins wants to go find another job, and in 7 years, maybe she'll become the first female Bank of Canada governor.
I know a lot of women were watching that to see if that was going to happen this morning. And we also know that the Prime Minister has said that the transition between Poloz and Macklem is going to be seamless. But of course, this is uncharted territory we're in. And speaking of that, amid the COVID-19 related relief spending and, of course, the economic damage caused by the pandemic, David, the Parliamentary Budget Officer is now saying that our federal deficit could reach a record high. What are we talking about here?
Yeah, record high. Oh boy, like all time, it's a huge high. The PBO says it could hit $252 billion this year. Let me put that in some context. The federal government's revenues are $320 billion a year. So if the federal government was going to balance a budget, it would take in $320 billion and spend $320 billion. Well, it's going to spend $320 billion, and it's going to spend another $250 billion on top of that by borrowing that money. So that is all going to be added to our debt at the end of the year, and it's going to increase our debt to GDP ratio from 30%, which is the best in the G7, to about 48%. Which will still be tops in the G7 because everybody else is borrowing right now. Now, the key question is, can we afford all that borrowing? And by and large, most economists and most bond rating agencies say, yes, Canada can afford that. We went into this in good fiscal shape. The political discussion will now be, okay, now how are we going to get back to more sustainable fiscal finances? Do we want to increase taxes, cut spending, or basically keep things about the same, but then look for a long time before we see those deficits go away? That's definitely going to be a discussion that I think politicians are going to engage in. Do Democrats have a different view than conservatives, who also have a different view than liberals about that?